Baldassarre's ordination to priesthood occurred June 29, 1963, 8 days after Giovanni Montini, the Pope Paul VI, was elected. That's interesting on several levels, but just quickly, first of all, because the number 8 is associated with destiny, divinity, occult fertility rites, resurrection, the incarnation of Jesus, as any bishop of Rome would know, but more importantly, the exact date of Baldassarre's ordination, June 29, 1963, is the very day on which Malachi Martin swore the enthronement of the fallen archangel Lucifer took place in the Roman Catholic citadel, and that ritual, as Martin called it, had two primary objectives. Number one, to enthrone Lucifer as the true prince over Rome, and secondly, to assure, ladies and gentlemen, the sorceress inception, an embodiment in flesh of that immaterial spirit into a priest, was made a person who would later become known as Petrus Romanus. Now, the problem with Baldassarre is that he doesn't yet appear to be papable. And so I think his role among these other players in this 1950s and 60s game that Malachi Martin wrote about, who all, by the way, right now, they're all the principal players. Every one of them are the principal players in Rome right now for the election of the next pope. I think he's a carrier. He's a collaborator, because the mystery of the 1963 conclave with the election of Pope Paul VI carries this secret that Steve Quayle and a few people know, but most of the world don't know. And that is by the way, this is called in investigative circles. If you want to investigate this for yourself, the listener, this is called the Siri thesis. It involves evidence that Cardinal Giuseppe Siri of Genoa, he was actually received the majority vote in both the 1958 and 63 conclaves, but under very mysterious pressure. What Malachi Martin swore was from Masonic influences. He refused the papal office. And by the way, when he was asked 20 years later if in both of those conclaves he had in fact been elected as pontiff, here's what Siri said, quote, "I am bound by the secret. The secret is horrible. I have books to write about the different conclaves. Very serious things have taken place, but I can say nothing," end quote. But ladies and gentlemen, Malachi Martin wasn't so silent. He claimed to be an eyewitness of the 63 conclave, and in his book, The Keys of This Blood, he said Siri was in fact elected pope in both 58 and 63, but that his election was set aside because of interference by an emissary of an internationally based organization, the Freemasons. And in our book, Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope Is Here, we talk about this. We document exactly what happened, and it is attributed to St. Malachi, the prophecy of the popes, in which we would be remiss not to point out how in 1958 the inevitability of Siri's election was believed so strongly that in Italy they connected it to the prophecy of the popes. They connected it to the prophecy of St. Malachi. In fact, they described Pius's successor as shepherd and sailor. That's number 107 in the prophecy of the popes, pastor et nata, and that was attributed to Siri, the maritime city that was connected to his lifelong home. So what I'm saying is there is a conspiracy here that is much deeper than the average individual is aware of, but all of it, all of the players, they're all back now. All of them are back now.
I have another question. If the Petrus Romanus is the final pope and he's among us right now, that means the Antichrist has to be walking the globe too. Any takers on who the Antichrist might be?
Well, let me tell you something, and then I'll shut up so other people can talk. There's something very strange that's going on, and this is why Chris and I drew back. I'm actually happy that we didn't publish this book 90 days ago, because I would have told you that no way, no how that Bertoni was not going to be Petrus Romanus. But now there's something else entirely going on. There's a struggle internally, and this is mafia politics at the deepest level. You're seeing just sparks of it in the news right now. But it's also very connected to the United States. And Steve and I have done long shows on this in the past, and the layout of Washington, D.C., the coming of Apollo. If we had time tonight, and we don't, we could talk about the obelisk at Rome and its connection and the blasphemy connected to that. But look at the headlines right now talking about this new Cardinal Timothy Dolan, and speculation about whether Dolan, who was just now, last Saturday, elevated to the position of cardinal. This is the second highest level in the Vatican. The second only to the Pope himself is to be elevated to this level in the cardinal and to be a part of the next conclave. And news reporters were already talking about how Timothy Dolan might become the first American Pope. Now, by the way, first let me say, I don't believe he will be. I don't believe that he will be Petrus Romanus. But imagine the last sole surviving superpower on earth having the president who could be, I'm not saying he will be, but could be the Antichrist, having from the United States the next Pope, who is the most powerful religious figure on earth, and all of this emanating from the United States, in which is also seated the United Nations. So is something happening?
We could be looking at the final Pope and maybe the final American president?
Well, we could be. And I would not connect it together in those ways, but what I will say is there is very, very powerful, satanic, seeing, prophetic connections right now.
You mentioned obelisk. Are these not phallic symbols? Not only in America, but also on the Vatican?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I could take the next half hour to talk about that, but I don't want to dominate the conversation. If Chris or Steve want me to, I could, but I'd love to hear
I'll add
them
a little
talk.
bit. I can add a little bit about the Jesuit. I mean, I didn't really go real deep into the Jesuit order in this research because I spent so much time on the papacy in Rome. But, in looking into Malachi Martin's work, he wrote, a lot of scholarly books, and one that he wrote in 1988 was about the Jesuits. And in that book, I mean, I have a quote right here in front of me where he says explicitly, and this isn't faction, this was actually a historical book. He says a state of war exists between the papacy and the religious order of the Jesuits. Okay, now a lot of this war was centered around liberation theology and some kind of socialistic elements that are in the Vatican. And the Jesuits, though, according to Martin, there's a satanic group of Jesuits. And I think that's what the caller was going to. And, he called that group the Roman Phalanx. And I think that it's safe to say that they have, assumed control. That group, that third, is probably running things. And that might be a lot of what we see that Tom's talking about in the press right now, where we see all this drama, and some of that's playing out. But, this has been going on for a while. That was in 1988 that Martin wrote that there's a state of war going on between the Jesuits and the papacy. So, what we're seeing now is just the surface is boiling from something that's been going on for years.
Well, I would add, Chris, what I would add to that, and I would add this for the sake of listeners who may be Catholic, the fact that there was a Masonic plot spelled out in the Alta Vendetta very much is related to what went on in 58, 63, the Jesuits, the conclaves, because don't forget that it was under those secret meetings, under those conclaves, when the popes were so-called elected, put into position, that would implement the Second Vatican Council and its vendetta-like heretical decrees. And people that have seen the movie, Steve, you might find this interesting, people who have seen the movie Angels and Demons, based on Dan Brown's book, in which the legendary society, the Illuminati, they plan to destroy the Vatican City with this newly discovered power of antimatter. Most readers of our book will not know that Dan Brown relied heavily on the actual secret history around the 1958-1963 conclaves in which Cardinal Siri was elected, but he stepped aside under threat from what some called Illuminati sources, that if he did not step aside, this is the actual history, a monstrous persecution of the Catholic faithful would be generated across Eastern Europe, schism would be manufactured by the French hierarchy, but furthermore, the setting off of a hydrogen bomb to destroy the Vatican and its officials would take place, and that's why Siri stepped aside. That's the actual history. Besides fiction, like Dan Brown, in our book, we actually cite a plethora of church fathers, Marian apparitions, Catholic seers, down through time, that forecast that these events were a pregame for the arrival of Petrus Romanus. Even St. Francis of Assisi, one of the most venerated religious figures in history, he gathered his devotees shortly before his death, and he prophesied, quote, "At the time of this tribulation, a man not canonically elected will be raised to the pontificate, who, by his cunning, will endeavor to draw many into error and death. Some preachers will keep silent about the truth, and others will trample it underfoot and deny it. For in those days Jesus Christ will send them not a true pastor, but a destroyer," end quote. And so the Vatican this year enters the golden anniversary of Vatican II, and it is a perfect time. The Illuminati would say it is a perfect time to install Petrus Romanus and to enact their revenge. And so the question then is, who's going to fulfill this dark augury of the prophets of the popes amidst this showdown that's occurring right now among the College of Cardinals inside the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican, and that's going to unfold during the next period of papal vacancy.
Do you think that Maitreya and the New Age ascended masters are to play a role in the end-time deception? You know, some are calling the Antichrist Maitreya or Aposticani. Go ahead, Steve.
Let me say this. You know, as one of the guys that broke the whole Maitreya thing on us 20 years ago, and, you know, when the national newspapers and world newspapers claiming the Christ is here, et cetera, I think Christians need to go back and learn their Bibles once again. Any spirit that denies Jesus Christ is Lord is the spirit of the Antichrist. And so Maitreya and the New Agers who worship the ascended masters, by the way, isn't it interesting, you guys, that a third keeps coming up? How many of the fallen angels, or how many of the angels of heaven fell? A third. We're talking about thirds. We're talking about 33. I think that plain and simple, I don't believe Maitreya is the Antichrist. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I'm just going to say, here's what I know. The unpleasant reality, and the world better get ready for it, is that there is a conflict right now over who is going to become the Antichrist, who is going to become Petrus Romanus. It is boiling beneath the surface in Rome. It is boiling beneath the surface in the United States. It's largely unknown to the public, who's totally asleep. And worse than the public who's totally asleep is the organized church that's completely asleep, but nevertheless foresaw by all kinds of seers, Catholic mystics. Father Herman Bernard Kramer, we didn't even talk about him tonight, in his work, The Book of Destiny, in which he provides this for the Catholic Church, that there's going to be, let me say it's a frightening prophecy, but it's also a strange and inaccurate interpretation, in my opinion, of the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation concerning the great wonder mentioned in verse 1. But here's what Father Kramer prophesies concerning Petrus Romanus. Quote, "The sign in heaven is that of a woman." Here's his interpretation of the book of Revelation. "The sign in heaven is that of a woman with child, crying out in her travail and anguish of delivery. In that travail, she gives birth to some definite person who is to rule the church with a rod of iron." Verse 5. "It then points to a conflict waged within the church to elect one who was to rule all nations." in the manner clearly stated. In accord with the text, this is unmistakably a papal election, he says, for only Christ and his vicar can have the divine right to rule all nations. But at this time, the great powers may take a menacing attitude to hinder the election of the logical and expected candidate by threats of a general apostasy, assassination, or imprisonment of this candidate if elected, end quote. So,